Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the uneven cobblestones of a medieval town square. The sun is dipping behind slate rooftops. The air smells faintly of horses, wood smoke, and something less pleasant. You hear the clang of a blacksmith's hammer in the distance. And then, a sharper noise. Laughter? No, jeers. You glance over, and there's a poor soul locked in the stocks, his only crime being the theft of a crust of bread. You might be tempted to intervene, but let's be honest. In the Middle Ages, you probably wouldn't survive this day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking slowly now, taking it all in. The sounds, the smells, the palpable tension in the air. Because while everyone talks about knights and castles, what they often forget is how easily you could end up punished. For anything. And how different that punishment might look, depending on whether your shoes were made of leather or hay. The divide between rich and poor wasn't just about gold coins and banquet feasts. It bled into every corner of life. Especially justice. You see a child chasing a chicken. Funny. Until you realize the chicken's not his, and that's technically theft. If caught, that child might lose a hand, or an ear, or simply vanish into a lord's prison and never be heard from again. It depends on the mood of the local judge, and more importantly, whether your father owns land, or just rents a patch of dirt and a half-broken plow. The legal system was as murky as the moat around the castle. Crimes weren't always defined clearly, and even when they were, enforcement was flexible. For the rich, there were letters of recommendation, family connections, and favors owed. For you, there was a damp cell and a guard who had garlic for breakfast. Historians still argue whether medieval law was meant to be so inconsistent, or whether it simply evolved that way through layers of custom, tradition, and convenience. Whatever the case, the result was a chaotic patchwork of local rules, church authority, and good old-fashioned bribery. You duck into a narrow alley and nearly trip over a beggar. He's missing 3 fingers. You don't ask why. He doesn't tell you. But you already know. He was probably caught stealing and couldn't afford to bribe his way out. Across town, in the shadow of the manor house, a young nobleman is playing dice and laughing about the time he accidentally stabbed a stable boy. No punishment. Just a long summer spent hawking with his uncle in the countryside. Even the tools of justice were different. Poor folk were hauled into crude wooden structures tied up with scratchy ropes, or marched through the mud for public whippings. The rich, if punished at all, were quietly summoned to chambers with heavy curtains and thick rugs, where they were politely asked to reconsider their behavior over a glass of weak wine. There's this odd paradox in the records. Justice was supposed to be public and visible, but when it came to nobles, justice went remarkably private. Sometimes it was house arrest in their own fortified estate. Imagine being told not to leave your room, in a castle, with servants. You could think of worse fates. But the town square, yes, the town square was different. That was reserved for you, the poor, the forgotten, the visible. Punishment was performance, and the poor were the cast. You step around a pile of cabbage leaves, and a cat hisses at you from a barrel. The stalks are empty now, but the ground around them is stained. Not with blood, too dramatic, but with old eggs, spoiled milk, and shame. Shame was cheap and plentiful. You could smell it. In some regions, punishments were decided by local lords or manor courts. These courts were technically for everyone. But let's just say your complaints about being overtaxed didn't carry the same weight as Sir Hugh's complaint that his neighbor's rooster crowed too early. Priorities. Even the language of the law revealed bias. Crimes committed against a noble were considered more serious than crimes committed by a noble. You read that right. So if you, a poor Thatcher, insulted Lady Margaret, you could be fined, flogged, or worse. But if Lady Margaret ran her carriage over your chicken cart, well, you might owe her for obstructing the road. Historians debate whether medieval people saw this as unfair. Some argue that everyone accepted the hierarchy as natural, even divine. Others think resentment simmered constantly, occasionally boiling over in revolts like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. But we'll get to that later. For now, just imagine. You, born in the wrong cottage, saying the wrong thing, on the wrong day, and suddenly your fate is tied to a wooden post while the crowd jeers. And your noble neighbor? He's sipping ale behind closed doors, smug in his invincibility. The wind picks up. You pull your cloak tighter. Somewhere, a bell tolls. Not for a wedding, not for mass, for punishment. And you start walking faster. You head toward the market square now, that heart of medieval village life. Equal parts commerce, gossip, and judgment. It's here, under the creaking wooden scaffolds and the flapping banners of faded saints, where the contrast between rich and poor punishment comes into full, awkward bloom. At the far end of the square, a familiar structure greets you. The pillory. Upright wooden boards with holes for a head and two hands. Simple, humiliating, and oh so very public. A poor farmer who insulted the reeve last week is currently locked in place. His hair is matted with something suspiciously tomato-like. It might be tomato. Or maybe a turnip that's seen better days. Either way, he's not having a great afternoon. Now picture the same insult coming from the lips of a wealthy merchant's son. The outcome? Likely a stern talking to. Possibly a mild rebuke from father over dinner. Or, if it really got messy, a short stay in the family home under watchful eyes. In other words, grounded. Punishment for the poor wasn't just harsher, it was theatrical. You were meant to be seen, to be laughed at, to be pitied and scorned. For the rich, punishment was discreet, because heaven forbid anyone of status be seen sweating in a public square with spoiled fish sliding down their face. In many places, nobles caught in minor offenses were simply confined to their own estates. House arrest. Picture this: being sent to your luxurious countryside manor, complete with gardens, tapestries, 3 servants per chair, and a pantry that would put modern snack cabinets to shame. Some nobles even requested these punishments. Oh no, you mean I have to spend spring in the Loire Valley instead of attending court? Tragic. Historians still argue whether these elite punishments were intended to be symbolic gestures or actual deterrents. Some records suggest nobles did feel genuine shame, especially when their misdeeds were known at court. Others indicate they treated punishment like a brief inconvenience, like waiting out bad weather in the drawing room. Meanwhile, for the poor, even a small crime could spiral into long-term suffering. Let's say you stole a loaf of bread. If your community was feeling charitable, maybe you'd get a warning. If not, you could end up whipped through the streets, tied to a cart, dragged from one end of the town to the other. Not exactly a spa day. The instruments of punishment themselves reflected this divide. Poor folk faced coarse rope, rusty manacles, and the splintered wood of punishment carts. For the noble few, there were silk ropes, yes, silk, used ceremonially in executions to preserve dignity. Some nobles even requested decapitation by sword rather than axe, because it was cleaner. One poor man was executed with a butcher's knife. A nobleman in the same town, given a choice of weapon and a priest at his side. It wasn't just the punishment itself. It was the process. The rich could hire advocates, proto-lawyers who spoke in Latin and looped logic around like yarn. The poor, if they even understood the charges, often didn't speak the court's language. And the judge? Likely a landowner himself, whose sympathy leaned predictably up the social ladder. Let's walk past the tavern. A noble's horse is tied outside, its hooves cleaner than your shoes. Inside, behind shuttered windows, 2 landowners are laughing. One of them is under official censure for collecting rent illegally. His punishment? A fine paid with the very rent he extorted. Step into the poor district. Cramped alleys, crooked doors, and soot-blackened walls. Here, punishment is constant, like bad weather or taxes. A child accused of pickpocketing stands in line behind a woman who took a chicken and a man who insulted a lord's new hat. The mood is not light. Some medieval towns even turned punishment into civic entertainment. Think of it like the world's bleakest street festival. Crowds gathered. Vendors sold pies. People cheered. The man in the stocks? Part of the show. Some towns even built viewing benches near gallows. Bring the kids. Pack a lunch. Morbid field trip. And yet, for all this, many medieval communities saw these punishments as necessary. They weren't trying to be cruel. They genuinely believed public shame deterred future crimes. The idea of justice was tangled with religion, with social order, with keeping the peace in a world that felt constantly on the brink. But the hypocrisy, oh, it was thick. One chronicler from the 14th century observed that a noble could commit fraud involving hundreds of coins and walk free, while a pauper who stole a chicken was hanged before sunset. Even the concept of prison was different depending on your class. For the rich, prison was a temporary formality, often spent in relative comfort, with books, food, and visitors. For the poor, a cold cell, rotting straw, no shoes, possibly no trial. Take a moment. You sit on a low stone wall, watching a group of children chase each other. One trips, falls, starts to cry. His mother rushes over, scoops him up, wipes his tears. In this world, the difference between comfort and cruelty is razor thin, and wealth is the blade. Your eyes drift back to the empty stocks. A shadow moves across them as the sun shifts. You wonder, will they be occupied tomorrow? Probably. Will it be someone rich? Almost certainly not. And so you rise, because there's more to see, and this walk through unequal justice is only just beginning. You take a slow turn down a side path leading to the local hall of records, or what passes for one in a medieval town. It's a squat stone building with uneven floors and walls that seem to lean just a bit too much. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of dust, beeswax, and unspoken truths. Shelves groan with scrolls, some tidy and bound with ribbon, others so tattered they look like they've been chewed by time itself. This is where you begin to understand another kind of medieval punishment, one that's quieter, cleaner, and far more convenient: fines. If you were poor, fines were an unbearable weight. Couldn't pay? No problem. Your punishment simply upgraded to physical suffering. For the wealthy, fines were a gentle tap on the wrist. You'd be surprised how many crimes you could commit for the price of a roasted pig. One scroll you examine details a local noble's altercation in a market. He punched a man in the face after a dispute over wine. The punishment? A fine of 5 shillings paid within the week. The same week, a peasant who stole a chicken out of hunger was fined the same amount. Unable to pay, he was beaten publicly and imprisoned for 3 days. You exhale. Not much of a comparison. Fines were more than just monetary slaps. They were a system unto themselves. They could be negotiated, appealed, postponed, or magically erased if you happened to be related to someone important. And for the particularly powerful, there was an even juicier escape route: pardons. Pardons were the Swiss Army knife of elite crime resolution. Did a young lord get too drunk and run someone over with a cart? Send a letter to the king, promise a donation to the church, and voila, your record is clean. Historians still debate the scope and frequency of these pardons. Some argue they were relatively rare and only granted in extreme cases. Others believe they were a common tool of political favor trading, offered liberally to those whose loyalty mattered more than their guilt. Now here's the odd twist. Sometimes nobles find themselves. Yes, really. As a performance of justice, a wealthy landowner might confess to a minor crime and pay a fine in public just to maintain appearances. It was theater, a gesture. Meanwhile, the poor didn't get to perform anything. They lived their sentences in bruises and broken ribs. You pass a clerk scribbling away with a goose feather. He's recording payments for the month. A merchant has paid a fee for failing to repair a section of road. That road collapsed, injuring a local child. The child's family. They paid a healer out of pocket. The merchant paid a silver groat and went back to lunch. The economy of punishment extended beyond law. Churches had their own little menu of forgiveness. Indulgences could absolve crimes both spiritual and secular for a fee. Committed adultery? Pay a sum and say a few prayers. Got caught poaching in church land? A donation might ease your soul and keep your limbs intact. You reach the town's small chapel. The priest, eyes half closed, mutters a prayer while tallying coins beside a wooden box marked penance offerings. You wonder how many broken lives were mended here by silver alone. But here's the kicker. Sometimes the fines weren't paid in coin at all. The poor were often fined in grain, in labor, or in livestock. Couldn't afford to pay the sheriff? You might owe him a week of free plowing, or a dozen eggs, or your daughter's hand in marriage. Yes, that was a real, if extreme, arrangement recorded in at least one grim local record, a solution to a family's unpaid debts. You walk on, more slowly now, past a farmhouse. A woman kneels by the hearth, her hands raw from scrubbing. Her husband was fined last month for building an unauthorized fence. He's still working it off by repairing the local road, for free. They couldn't pay in money, so they're paying in time, energy, and dignity. The rich, meanwhile, sometimes used fines to their advantage. In certain regions, they could prepay penalties, like a parking meter. They'd say, yes, I'm planning to hold an illegal feast on church fasting day. Here's the expected fine in advance. It sounds absurd, because it is. But it happened. You remember something from earlier, the boy who was fined for stealing bread. That fine could have been a life sentence. Not just because he couldn't pay it, but because it followed him. Debts weren't just economic, they were social. Owe enough people, and your name became shorthand for trouble. Your family's chances? Slim. Your marriage prospects? Diamond soys. Your ability to own land or join a guild? Gutted. Some towns even posted the names of unpaid fines publicly. A medieval version of being doxxed. The shaming wasn't just financial, it was total. So you see, fines weren't some light punishment. They were a class-sensitive hammer. For the poor, they led to deeper poverty, harder labor, and spirals of misfortune. For the wealthy, a minor inconvenience, easily brushed away like dust from a velvet sleeve. Historians continue to wrestle with this disparity. Were the rich truly blind to the consequences of fines for the poor? Or did they understand it perfectly and just didn't care? You pass under an archway, your steps echoing. Somewhere behind you, a bell tolls again. Another crime judged, another coin passed, another injustice wrapped in a ribbon of bureaucracy. And now you wonder, was there ever truly justice here? Or was the law merely another ledger? One that favored anyone who could afford to write in gold ink. You turn a corner into a quieter part of the town, where the streets grow narrower and the air seems cooler somehow. Here, stories live in the creaking shutters and the crooked doorways. It's the perfect place to consider one of the most bizarre forms of justice ever practiced: trial by ordeal. Imagine this. You're accused of a crime. There's no witness, no camera footage, no fingerprint dusting, because of course none of that exists yet. Instead, the court decides whether you're guilty or innocent by making you walk across burning iron or plunge your arm into a boiling cauldron. If your wounds heal quickly, you're innocent. If they fester, oops, guilty. Either way, you're getting blisters. This was real. And it wasn't just limited to obscure villages or far-flung corners of Europe. Ordeals were widespread. There was the ordeal by cold water, where you were tied up and dropped into a pond. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty, because floating meant you were rejected by the water, obviously aligned with dark forces. It's all terribly scientific. Now, if you're a peasant, you don't have much say in this. You're accused, and before you know it, you're barefoot on the church floor, about to carry a red-hot iron 3 paces, while the priest watches with solemn boredom. You already know you'll be scarred, no matter what the outcome is. But let's imagine you're a nobleman. Same accusation. Let's say theft, for simplicity. What happens? Well, your trial might take a different path. Instead of a red-hot iron, you might be granted a trial by combat. That sounds epic, right? Until you realize it usually meant hiring a trained champion to fight in your place. And guess what? The rich could afford the best muscle money could buy. There's a reason trial by ordeal faded faster for nobles. They had alternatives: legal advisors, royal appeals, clerical protection. For the poor, ordeals lingered like bad weather. You couldn't out-talk your way around a boiling pot if you barely spoke Latin and didn't know the bishop's nephew. Historians still argue whether medieval people believed in the spiritual logic of these ordeals or if they understood them as social tools, ritualized shows to reinforce hierarchy. Perhaps it was both. Maybe belief and power walked hand in hand. There's even evidence that some ordeals were rigged mercifully. Priests might cool the iron slightly or use lukewarm water if they wanted you to pass. But again, this mercy required connection, influence, reputation, none of which the local swineherd usually had. You pass by the remains of an old parish hall, crumbling but proud. This might have been where villagers gathered for these dramatic decisions. You picture a crowd assembled, breath steaming in the morning chill, watching a terrified woman, accused of petty theft, lower her trembling hand into a pot of near-boiling water. Behind her, the reeve strokes his chin. Behind him, the local lord sips something warm and says nothing. Let's talk about another ordeal. The ordeal of the cross. This one was popular in earlier centuries. Two people accused of the same crime would stand with their arms outstretched like Christ on the cross. Whoever dropped their arms first was guilty. It was less about sin and more about stamina. Basically, early medieval yoga, if yoga determined whether or not you were executed. It's worth noting that nobles almost never subjected themselves to ordeals unless there was no other choice. More often, their fates were decided in royal courts or ecclesiastical hearings behind closed doors. And of course, they always had someone to testify on their behalf. You, on the other hand, you had your sweat, your fear, and whatever prayers you could whisper fast enough. There's one documented case of a peasant woman who underwent the hot iron ordeal and passed. Her hand healed without infection. Miraculous. But rather than being exonerated, she was quietly punished anyway. The court claimed God's will was unclear, which is medieval code for, "We don't like your face." In another case, a baron's steward committed a serious crime. Rather than an ordeal or trial, he was simply relocated to a different estate, like a problem goose. Justice served with a side of relocation benefits. As you continue walking, you begin to feel it. The absurdity, the imbalance, the way pain itself was a commodity. For the rich, it was avoidable. For the poor, it was mandatory. There were no lawyer dramas, no impassioned speeches, no last-minute evidence. There was only the fire, the rope, the water, and your luck. One final quirk. Some towns replaced ordeals with community oaths. You'd gather 12 people, neighbors, friends, and they'd swear you were innocent. If enough of them vouched for you, you walked free. Nobles had a much easier time gathering 12 loyal names. Peasants? Harder, especially if your neighbor's pig recently wandered onto your garden. So you walk on, passing a wooden pole stained with soot. It once held a cauldron. Now it just holds moss and memories. And as you listen to your own footsteps echoing down the empty road, you wonder, how many feet ran in fear down this path before you? And how many, spared by wealth, never had to run at all? Your path winds toward the edge of town, where the homes thin out and the air grows cooler. Here, the fields stretch long and silent, dotted with gnarled trees and the occasional crumbling stone. You've come to a place where rumors used to gather like fog, at the boundary of justice and superstition. Because now it's time to talk about witches. You hear that word and immediately picture bonfires and black cats, cackling women and crooked hats. But the reality, as always, is stranger and more uneven. Because while accusations of witchcraft could get you killed, whether you actually faced that fate depended less on what you did and more on who you were. Let's say you're a poor widow living on the edge of a village. You talk to yourself. You own a suspicious number of herbs. You once made a neighbor's rash disappear with a poultice made from weeds and animal fat. Congratulations. You're now a prime witch suspect, and worse, you have no powerful relatives to speak up for you. Your trial? Laughable. The accusation alone could be enough. Maybe someone saw you talking to a black dog. Maybe someone had a bad dream about you. Maybe the local well dried up and people just felt weird. All roads lead to the same result: rope, fire, and ash. But now, let's shift. Same town, same strange herbs, same weird dog. But this time, you're from a prominent family. Maybe your father holds land. Maybe your brother is a merchant. Maybe you once served bread to the bishop. Suddenly, you're not a witch. You're a little eccentric, possibly mystical, a woman of unusual talents. Historians still argue whether witch trials were more about religion or social control. But one thing is clear: your class shaped your odds. The lower you were, the more likely your quirks became curses. And it wasn't just women, by the way. Men were accused too, usually if they were poor, isolated, or otherwise inconvenient. A sickly shepherd who muttered to himself in Latin? Suspicious. A nobleman with a vast library of esoteric texts? Probably just well-read. You reach a small hill overlooking a disused pasture. Long ago, this was a site of execution, not by fire, no trees nearby. Here, witches were likely hanged. Less dramatic, but equally final. You stand quietly, imagining the scene, the gathering crowd, the whispered prayers, the accused, barefoot, eyes wide, still hoping someone might speak on her behalf. And perhaps the cruelest twist of all, the tests for witches, floating in water, pricking the skin to find insensitive spots, looking for devil's marks, birthmarks, moles, scars. Everyone had them, but only some were declared proof of guilt. If you were wealthy, you might have your own healer or midwife, someone who used herbs just as you did. But she was protected, employed, respected. You, the village hedge witch, were not. And if the local magistrate was looking to score political points? Well, burning a poor woman at the stake made a great show of moral righteousness, one especially unsettling custom: forced confessions, often extracted under torture, or the threat of it. You might admit to flying on broomsticks or dancing with the devil just to end the pain. The rich, naturally, could avoid such interviews. Many weren't even arrested, just investigated, and then quietly released. You wander further, past a mossy stone circle that once marked the property line of a now-vanished farm. The wind whistles through the grass. In one town's record, a woman was burned for causing the cows to stop giving milk. Her defense? She didn't even own a cow. Meanwhile, in a nearby manor, a noblewoman experimented with tinctures made from poppies and willow bark. Today, we'd call it early pain relief. Then, it was curious leisure, not medicine, not witchcraft, just an aristocratic hobby. There's a bitter humor in that. The poor were punished for the same behaviors the wealthy were praised for. And not just behaviors, outcomes. A noble's fortune was a sign of God's blessing. A poor woman's luck, obviously dark magic. You glance up and see a carving in the stone, faded, barely legible. It's a name, etched roughly by someone whose hands probably shook. You imagine it was a lover, a friend, or maybe even the accused herself, trying to leave something behind. This isn't ancient history. Some areas continued trying, torturing, and executing witches well into the early modern period. The famous Salem trials happened in the 1690s. And though they're often romanticized now, the truth is far more brutal and boring. Suspicion, class bias, and power dynamics wrapped in holy language. One final irony: some rich people faked witchcraft. They threw lavish parties involving seances, spirit summoning, and candlelit divination. These were considered fashionable, enlightened even. But you, scratching a spell into your garden to keep the rabbits away? Heresy. So you step away from the pasture, careful not to trip on a root. You feel the weight of centuries pressing around you. Punishment in the Middle Ages wasn't about guilt. It was about place, where you stood, who stood behind you, and who was willing to push. You reach the path again, and the village reappears in the distance. And as you walk, you carry the whisper of those who didn't get to finish their own stories. Not because they were witches, but because they were poor. You're back within earshot of the village now, and the atmosphere feels a little more animated. Laughter rolls through the air, mingled with the clop of hooves and the cheerful calls of vendors. But you notice something else, too, a familiar tension underneath the buzz. It becomes clearest when you reach the central square again, where a familiar performance is just about to begin. No, it's not a festival. It's punishment. A young man is led forward, his hands bound with coarse rope. He's not bleeding. He's not screaming. Not yet, anyway. Because this isn't a whipping. This is public shame, a time-honored tradition. And whether you're sleepy or skeptical, it's worth understanding how entire communities treated punishment like street theater. The man is being strapped into the pillory, one of the most popular forms of medieval humiliation. His crime? Speaking out against the Lord's tax collector. Not an insult, not violence, just words. But words, when spoken by someone poor, had sharp consequences. He will stand there for hours, and while he does, the townspeople are invited, encouraged, really, to participate. They hurl insults, old vegetables, perhaps the occasional bit of dung. If they're feeling generous, they'll just mock him until his ears burn, and his dignity erodes like rain on old limestone. You watch quietly from the crowd. No one seems angry exactly. In fact, people are smiling. Kids are laughing. It's entertainment. And that's what makes it so unsettling. Punishment wasn't just a deterrent. It was a show. For the poor, anyway. Nobles? They didn't get paraded through the streets. No stocks, no pillories, no public jeering. Their punishments, if issued at all, happened behind walls. Gilded, velvet-lined walls with polite apologies and ample refreshments. Historians still argue whether these public rituals were designed to unite the community through shared values, or simply to reinforce existing power structures. Probably both. Because nothing brings people together like the collective permission to mock someone lower on the ladder. You shift your weight as the man in the pillory groans. A child throws an onion, misses, laughs anyway. The scene is uncomfortable, but it plays out just as it has for generations. It's tradition. In some towns, there were even designated shaming days, market day punishments, weekly spectacles. Locals looked forward to it, like watching your favorite drama unfold in real time. Bread? Check. Gossip? Check. Humiliation? Check. One town in Germany had a special mask, crafted to look like a pig's face, that wrongdoers had to wear while standing in the square. Another region used a scold's bridle, a metal cage for the mouth, designed to punish women accused of gossiping. You can almost feel the cold metal tighten just thinking about it. But if a noble gossiped, well, they just called it politicking. There's a small platform at the edge of the square, raised slightly, polished by years of use. That's where announcements are made. It's also where apologies were sometimes forced. Poor offenders might be made to kneel and publicly confess, usually with exaggerated humility. Rich offenders? Rarely required. They had letters. They had messengers. They had distance. In some cases, rich offenders did have to issue apologies, but from the comfort of their homes, with legal scribes in attendance. One famous nobleman apologized for unlawful hunting by having his steward send a letter to the sheriff, along with a small basket of pears. You glance again at the man in the pillory. He's slumped now. Tired. Embarrassed. Maybe angry. Hard to tell. What's clear is that he won't forget this day, and neither will the crowd. Because while public punishment broke the spirit of the accused, it also served as a bedtime story for the village. Misbehave, and this could be you. This wasn't unique to Europe, by the way. Variations of public shame as punishment appeared across many cultures. In Japan, you might wear a sign around your neck describing your crime. In parts of Africa, symbolic humiliation, like being made to dance in women's clothing, was used to shame male wrongdoers. Shame crosses oceans. But again, It rarely touched the elites. Their dignity was protected like an artifact. No public trials, no loud declarations. If something embarrassing happened, it was quietly cleaned up, washed away with influence and polite silence. One town even had different locations for public punishment depending on class. The central square was for commoners. The rear courtyard, hidden, shaded, was where the very rare noble might be chastised. Symbolically, of course. Maybe a fine, maybe a strongly worded sermon. As you meander back toward the inn, you think of the stories whispered over ale. Everyone in town remembers who was in the stocks last year, but no one talks about Lord Elric's scandal. Why? Because Lord Elric throws very generous feasts. The man in the pillory coughs, someone laughs, someone else walks away, and the day continues. It makes you wonder, how much of justice is really about making things right, and how much is just about keeping the audience entertained? You drift from the square into the narrow corridors of the wealthier quarter, where cobblestone paths are straighter, windows have glass instead of oiled parchment, and the air smells faintly of rosemary. Here, punishment takes a different shape, a softer, quieter one. Because when nobles committed crimes, they didn't just escape the lash, they escaped the spectacle. Let's say you're a duke. You've had a bit too much wine at a banquet, and in a blur of velvet and hubris, you run your sword through your steward, an unfortunate misunderstanding, of course. In theory, this is manslaughter. But you're not going to the stocks. No, your punishment will involve reflection. Perhaps in the countryside. Maybe on a family estate with a pleasant lake and an unusually lenient chaplain. This wasn't rare. In fact, noble crimes were handled in what we might call the gentleman's justice system, a separate world with its own vocabulary. Nobles didn't steal, they misappropriated. They didn't assault, they breached protocol. It's like crime went through a translator before reaching the court records. One notorious example, a lord in the early 14th century who killed a servant over a spilled goblet of wine. Instead of a trial, he received a formal censure and was asked to make a modest donation to a nearby monastery. A literal penance you could pay in coin, and maybe a goat. And here's where it gets especially curious. Nobles were often tried by their peers, other nobles, which is a bit like being tried for stealing cookies by the cookie-eating guild. Historians still argue whether these peer tribunals were effective or just pageantry. Some say they upheld a sense of honor. Others suggest they simply protected their own, doling out minor penalties and polite rebukes while the peasants watched from outside the iron gates. You glance at one such gate now, tall and spiked and unnecessarily decorative. Beyond it lies a small manor house where Lady Catherine once ordered her maid whipped for singing out of tune. Technically that was illegal, but Lady Catherine's brother sat on the local council. The incident never made it into any official record. Meanwhile, that same year, a cobbler's apprentice was beaten in the square for scuffing a church bench with muddy boots. The double standard wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Nobles were thought to possess a higher sense of responsibility, and thus were believed to suffer internally for their wrongs. Their punishment was their remorse. Or at least, that's what the chroniclers claimed. You can practically hear the violins playing in the background. But let's be real. Remorse rarely stopped them from doing it again. Theft among the nobility was especially absurd. Imagine a baron borrowing grain from a tenant's field. It wasn't theft, it was a tax adjustment, or a resource reallocation. And when peasants protested, they were labeled troublemakers, disturbers of the peace, not because they were wrong, but because they dared to speak. Even when nobles committed serious crimes, murder, treason, fraud, they often found refuge in a royal pardon, a signed scroll bearing the king's seal, wiping away their sins with a flick of wax. One noble was known to have received 3 such pardons in a single decade. At that point, you'd think someone might reconsider the system. You pause in front of a carved wooden door with iron studs, the kind of door only rich people have. It's silent behind it now. But long ago, this was where a baronet kept his mistress locked away for months. A scandal? Number an affair. She died there, He paid for a new church bell. Justice, served cold and polished. And while these stories pile up like dried leaves in an alley, the larger truth becomes clearer. Punishment wasn't about crime, it was about optics. And the nobility mastered the art of looking clean, even when their hands were soaked in ink, sweat, or worse. Even when nobles were imprisoned, which did happen occasionally, their cells looked more like rustic guest rooms. They were allowed food from home, servants, books, visitors. The term house arrest comes from these arrangements, literal confinement to one's own luxurious house. In contrast, the poor rotted in stone dungeons without windows, ate gruel, slept on straw. That is, if they survived long enough to reach trial at all. One more story before you move on. A countess was caught poisoning her husband, not lethally, just enough to make him sick during an inheritance dispute. Her punishment? She was retired to a convent, a rather plush one located on the coast. She took her maid and lapdog. Reports say she continued to host small teas. You shake your head gently, half in disbelief, half in resignation. Because here in the medieval upper crust, wrongdoing didn't end with punishment. It ended with a reshuffling of titles, a quiet donation, or a retreat into luxurious silence. The real sentence? The world never calling it a crime in the first place. You leave the manor district behind and follow a rutted track toward the edge of town where the real grit of peasant life shows itself. In the mud, in the sagging roofs, in the chickens that rule the road like feathered tyrants. This is where village-level justice plays out, not with scrolls and seals, but with stools, dung buckets, and an alarming amount of community enthusiasm. You're about to enter the curious, often grimy world of folk punishment. Low-budget, high-impact justice for the local working class. Here, the courts were simpler, the punishment stranger, and the emphasis leaned heavily on humiliation over harm. Let's begin with one of the most infamous, the cucking stool. It sounds vaguely whimsical, like a wooden seat at a bake sale. It was not. It was a chair, often attached to a long pole or mounted on a seesaw-like contraption, used to dunk offenders into water, usually cold, murky, questionably alive water. And who got dunked? Mostly women. Specifically, those accused of being scolds, a term that basically meant too outspoken. Sometimes it meant gossiping. Other times it meant being a woman with opinions. Noble women were spared this aquatic adventure. But if you were poor and mouthy, splash. In one village, a woman named Agnes was dunked 3 times in a single week. Her crime? Challenging the dignity of her husband's cousin. No further explanation needed, apparently. Men weren't entirely safe either. Drunkards, petty thieves, and lazy laborers could be dunked, tied to dung carts, or even forced to wear ridiculous costumes as punishment. In one recorded case, a man who kept stealing eggs was made to parade through the village wearing a chicken mask. He clucked the whole way, under threat of whipping. You step around a mossy stump and find an old wooden cart, warped, wheelless, and splattered with age-old residue. In its time, this cart probably hauled potatoes on Monday, firewood on Tuesday, and petty criminals on Wednesday. A jack of all trades. What made these punishments unique was their intense localism. Every village had its own flair. One hamlet might tie a dishonest butcher to a tree and pelt him with sausage links. Another might force a cheating husband to wear his wife's bonnet while cleaning chamber pots in the street. It was theatrical, embarrassing, and above all, public. Historians still debate whether these customs were officially sanctioned or just tolerated with a wink. Some were written down in manor rolls. Others lived in oral tradition, passed from wagging tongue to wagging tongue. And yes, the rich largely avoided these shenanigans. They didn't get tied to carts or dunked in ponds. If they needed correcting, it was done behind closed doors, probably with some awkward dinner conversation and a temporary loss of falconry privileges. You pass a shallow ditch, now dry and filled with nettles. Long ago, it might have served as the town's designated dunking pit. A woman once fell ill after being plunged there during a snowstorm. She survived, but she lost 3 toes and a chunk of her reputation. The punishments here weren't just physical. they were social glue. Everyone gathered to watch. Children pointed. Old men heckled. Neighbors leaned in close to murmur, "Did you hear why she's in the stool today?" For a community with limited diversions, local punishment was better than a puppet show and almost as juicy as stew night. But the cruelty was sharp. For the poor, these punishments could stick for life. No matter how many years passed, someone would remember that time you were marched through town in a sack or sat backwards on a donkey holding a turnip for no discernible reason. One of the most stomach-churning punishments? The latrine sentence. This involved cleaning out the communal cesspit by hand. It was handed down for offenses like public drunkenness, minor theft, or generally being a nuisance. You can almost smell it just thinking about it. Unsurprisingly, the noble class never found themselves wrist-deep in the village waste trench. One village elder you pass, wrinkled, bent over, eyes sharp as flint, whispers a memory as you walk by. He saw his uncle made to sleep in the pigsty for insulting the reeve. Not for a night, for a week. They called him Pigmouth for years. You can't help but notice. These punishments were deeply creative. Petty, sometimes hilarious, sometimes cruel, and always remembered. The punishment was the story it created. You could endure a whipping and be forgotten. But if you were made to dress like a goat and bray for an afternoon, you were folklore. Of course, none of this applied if you had land, title, or favor. Nobles never clucked, never dunked, never cleaned latrines. They might pay a fine, at worst, write a sheepish letter, but they would never be the village joke. And so you leave the folk district behind, brushing past drying laundry and the smell of cabbage soup, and you think about all those people who endured these little spectacles. All because they had no coin, no cousin at court, and no silk-lined robe to hide behind. Their punishments weren't just about crime. They were about keeping people in their place, with laughter, with shame, and with just enough stink to make sure no one forgot. You follow a winding footpath now, away from the thickets of cabbage and scolded chickens, toward a squat stone building shaded by ancient elms. The building is different from the others you've passed, heavier, less welcoming. No laughter here, just thick walls, a small iron cross above the door, and a sense that once you went in, you didn't always come out. This is the local clergy house, and it's time we talk about the medieval cheat code, benefit of clergy. See, in theory, everyone was equal before God, but in practice, God had favorites, or rather, society claimed he did, namely, those who wore robes, read Latin, and spent a lot of time pretending to be confused by their own financial ledgers. The benefit of clergy was a loophole so wide you could march a camel through it in full ecclesiastical regalia. Originally, it was meant to protect members of the church from secular punishment. You commit a crime? If you're a clergyman, the church handles it internally, and internally often meant less blood, more prayer, and plenty of wine-soaked atonement. But over time, this privilege expanded. All you had to do was prove you were part of the clergy. And how did you prove that? Simple. You just had to read a short passage from the Bible. Yes, really. It became known as the neck verse, because if you could read it, you saved your neck. Literally. It was often Psalm 51 verse 3, which begins, "Have mercy upon me, O God." Fitting, right? Especially if your hands were still red from robbing someone's pantry. The twist? You didn't have to actually be a priest, just literate, which meant nobles and the educated elite, already protected by wealth, now had divine immunity through their ABCs. You stand beside a narrow window of the clergy house and imagine the scene inside. A trembling man caught stealing declares, "I claim benefit of clergy." The judge sighs. A Bible is produced. The man recites the verse, badly but legibly. The court nods. He is released to the church's mercy. Now imagine the same scenario, but the accused is a farmhand who can't read. He doesn't even know the psalm exists. No verse, no mercy. Straight to the stocks, or worse. Historians still argue whether the benefit of clergy began with good intentions or if it was just another tool for the elite. Some say it was necessary in a time when clergy were seen as separate from worldly affairs. Others argue it quickly became a farce, an escape hatch with a fancy bookmark. You walk inside the clergy house. It's quiet, musty, and filled with the echoes of parchment and hushed forgiveness. Somewhere, there's a list of names. Men who walked free because they knew how to pronounce iniquity. Their crimes ranged from petty theft to outright murder, but they got out with a penance and maybe a pilgrimage. In time, even laymen began memorizing the verse, pretending to read it. The courts knew. But proving fraud was difficult, so they let it slide, especially if the accused had respectable connections. Eventually, the system was abused so often that laws were passed to limit it. But the rich still found ways around those too. Some carried the verse on a strip of cloth. Others bribed court clerks to testify to their literacy. A few bold nobles just made up entire psalms. It worked more often than you'd think. You sit on a worn wooden bench and look out at the road beyond. The real absurdity hits you. In an age of faith, reading a verse became a judicial superpower. Not prayer, not repentance. Reading. Imagine being a mother of 5, hungry, desperate, caught stealing cheese, and watching the merchant's son, who assaulted someone, walk free because he could quote a psalm his tutor drilled into him while you were boiling nettles for soup. Some peasants tried to fake their way through. One man, according to a dusty record from Sussex, tried to claim benefit of clergy and recited something that was clearly just gibberish with a Latin accent. He was flogged for mocking the court. You lean back, the bench creaking, and wonder how many people practiced that single verse over and over in the dark, whispering it under their breath, just in case. The church eventually created a tiered system. First-time offenders were treated more leniently. Repeat offenders? Not so lucky. But again, who tracked these records? Usually local officials. And who influenced those officials? Nobles, bishops, landowners, the usual suspects. There's even a record of one noblewoman who claimed benefit of clergy. She was caught in a rather suspicious accident involving her husband's disappearance down a well. She read the neck verse flawlessly, walked free, then donated a bell tower to the church. Coincidence? Probably not. And here's the dark cherry on top. Many clergy-run prisons were far more comfortable than royal dungeons. You might get a private cell, clean straw, even decent food. It wasn't the Hilton, but it beat the pit under the sheriff's hall where rats were your roommates and mold was your pillow. So you rise from the bench and step out into the light, blinking. The wind smells of time and something faintly sour, maybe justice, left out in the sun too long. The benefit of clergy wasn't about God. It was about distance, the distance between those who could afford to read and those who had no one to read to them. As you wander down a rutted path leading from the clergy house back toward town, your boots catch on stones lodged in the road, some sharp, some smooth, all indifferent to your presence. The stones remind you of another kind of uneven surface, the medieval prison system, and how different it looked depending on your social station. Let's talk about who got jailed and who just got politely asked not to leave the estate. Jail, in the Middle Ages, was not a sentence in itself. It was a holding pattern, like being stuck in an airport where the food is moldy, the seats are wet, and someone might hang you at boarding. You were kept there while awaiting trial, ransom, or a verdict. And guess who ended up in jail most often? That's right, the poor. Not because they were more criminal, but because they couldn't afford any other option. Couldn't pay your fine? Jail. Couldn't post bail? Jail. Couldn't bribe a clerk or recite the neck verse with flair? Jail again. Meanwhile, nobles didn't go to jail. They retreated. Sometimes to a guarded estate, sometimes to a cushy room in a castle tower. There are actual records of noble prisoners bringing servants, writing poetry, and complaining about the quality of their firewood. One was even allowed to keep a falcon. You know, a support falcon. You step now into the town's holding cell. More of a stone hut than a prison. Low ceiling, no windows. A single wooden bench, scarred by knife marks and centuries of suffering. You can smell old urine. You can feel old fear. A peasant who failed to pay taxes might spend a week here, his only food provided by sympathetic relatives, if he had any. His crime? Poverty. His sentence? Hunger and humiliation. Some towns actually charged rent for jail time. You heard that right. Stay in jail too long and you owed more money for the privilege. Couldn't pay that either? Well, then you'd stay a little longer, like an unwanted guest in your own punishment. You run your fingers along the wall. The stone is rough, but warm where the sun hits. Carvings here and there. M.E. God help. A drawing of what looks like a pig with a crown. Someone's attempt at political satire, perhaps. Historians still argue whether medieval prisons were meant to rehabilitate or simply contain, but there's little evidence of structured reform. No counseling, no group therapy, just you, your lice, and whatever song you could hum to keep from screaming. Some cells had iron rings driven into the wall to chain people upright. One record tells of a man shackled for 21 days, standing, because he insulted a Lord's steward. He was never charged, just held. You step out of the cell and let the door creak closed behind you. Just a few yards away stands the home of a wealthy merchant. Fresh paint, open shutters, a maid sweeping the steps. This man's son was accused last year of attacking a stable boy. His punishment? A quiet few weeks in his father's study, then a pilgrimage to a monastery. Purely symbolic, of course. That's the pattern. The rich disappeared rather than being jailed. Missing. Away on family business. On retreat. A noble who committed fraud might be sent to the countryside for reflection, possibly with a generous stipend to ease his sorrow. In some cases, nobles chose prison as a temporary escape from politics or unwanted marriages. One count voluntarily spent a week in monastic confinement to restore his soul. It was considered trendy. And of course, there were ransom prisons, facilities where captured knights or aristocrats were held for ransom during wartime. These were not dungeons. They were more like gated bed and breakfasts with archery lessons. If the prisoner paid, or had friends who would, the stay was quite civil. You'd even dine with your captor. But for the poor, prison was never optional. There was no chess, no poetry about chess, only the slow gnawing of time and neglect. A study from one English town showed that nearly all prisoners from lower classes were held for debt-related issues. Not violence, not theft, debt. You pass a crumbling wooden sign, "To the debtor's lane." It once led to a row of cells used only for those who owed money. Entire families could end up in there. Children growing up behind bars because their father couldn't pay a merchant for bad flour. One boy became a chimney sweep after release. Another, a thief. That's what you call a pipeline. And lest you think this was confined to one region, this pattern spanned from England to France to parts of the Holy Roman Empire. Even in early Islamic cities with more structured legal systems, rich offenders found ways to sidestep confinement through charitable donations and influence. One last image before you leave this corner of history. Picture a woman jailed for violating sumptuary laws, wearing clothing deemed too fine for her station. Her crime, pride, her punishment, a week in jail, stripped of her dress, forced into rags, and released with a shorn head. Humiliation, cold and unrelenting. Now picture a noble woman who wears a scandalous gown that reveals too much shoulder. She's not jailed, she's painted. You leave the prison behind, the sun warm on your face now, but something lingers, a chill that justice wasn't blind. It just squinted when it looked at silk. You step back onto the cobbled main road, and before long, the wind catches the edge of a worn linen banner fluttering above the marketplace. It shows the silhouette of a man and woman, both draped in simple robes, both facing away from a heap of rich fabrics. A public reminder of something once taken very seriously: sumptuary laws. Now, you may not be familiar with the term, but the idea is simple. Sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what. Clothing, fabrics, colors, accessories, everything from the width of your belt to the pointiness of your shoes was regulated. Why? Because medieval societies believed fashion wasn't just fashion. It was class identity, stitched right into your hem. You walk slowly past a tailor's stall where bolts of dyed wool lie folded in a sad rainbow of browns, grays, and washed-out blues. These were the colors of the poor. Dyes like crimson, violet, deep emerald, reserved for the rich. Not metaphorically, legally. So let's say you're a hard-working blacksmith's daughter. You manage to buy a bit of second-hand velvet from a traveling merchant. You sew yourself a new overdress, something nice for the harvest dance. You walk into town feeling beautiful, proud, and then the reeve sees you. Within hours, you're fined, maybe jailed, maybe marched through the square in your lovely velvet, with a sign around your neck labeling you a pretender. The dress is confiscated. You are not. Contrast that with a noble who flouts the law by wearing a French-style doublet 6 months before it's officially sanctioned by the crown. The punishment? A letter from a cousin suggesting they tone it down. Maybe. Historians still debate the true purpose of these laws. Some say they were meant to keep social order, to prevent peasants from pretending to be noble, which might confuse people. Others argue it was just fashion gatekeeping, weaponized by those in power to keep elegance exclusive. You pass a group of children playing dress-up with scraps. One's wrapped in a frayed curtain, pretending to be a duchess. Her friend, wearing a cabbage leaf for a hat, bows dramatically. It's funny, until you remember that grown adults were once punished for similar creativity. Sumptuary laws varied wildly by region. In England, a 1363 statute declared that servants could not wear cloth costing more than 2 shillings a yard. In Florence, laws limited the number of rings a woman could wear at once. In Spain, lace was restricted by rank. And in some Islamic courts, turbans were coded by class. Bigger turban, bigger power. But enforcement, that's where things got messy. You see, poor people were always visible. Their clothes were examined like produce at market. Any deviation stood out. A too bright sash, trouble. Boots too clean, suspicious. A hemline 1 inch too long, that might land you in the Reeves ledger. The wealthy, on the other hand, had a buffer zone. They weren't seen the same way. They weren't inspected. And if they were, well, they had excuses. One noblewoman, caught in a gown laced with gold thread, claimed it was a gift from a cousin abroad and worn purely for educational purposes. She was let off with a warning, probably while sipping wine. There's a dusty record of a poor merchant's wife punished for wearing silk laces. Her defense? They were dyed wool, not silk. She even brought the thread to prove it. But the steward felt it and disagreed. Verdict: fined, whipped, and banned from town for a week. Meanwhile, the town's wealthiest widow wore imported velvet so heavy it had to be carried on a separate mule. No one said a word, because, as they whispered, she paid for the church roof. Fair trade, apparently. You turn down a lane where spindly clotheslines sag between crooked homes. Linen underthings flap beside patched tunics. One woman smooths a dress with care, knowing exactly which seams to hide, because she remembers last autumn, when her cousin wore a ribbon that was too red and spent 3 days locked in the town shed. Sometimes the laws were even used as traps. A visiting merchant might be accused of overdressing just to justify seizing their goods. Town officials got a cut. The clothes were sold or worn by someone with better friends. It wasn't justice. It was fashion policing meets asset seizure. And here's the kicker. The lines between legal and illegal dress shifted constantly. A new edict might ban sleeves above a certain width, only to reverse the rule 2 years later. Keeping up was a full-time job, one you could only afford if you had time, tutors, and tailors. The poor? They wore what they could, what was handed down, what hadn't rotted. And if it looked too nice, well, that was a crime. You stop before a shrine near the square. Hanging from a hook is a faded scrap of red fabric, once part of a confiscated cloak, now a warning. "Pride goeth before punishment," it reads, a tidy rhyme for a messy truth. Sumptuary laws didn't protect virtue. They protected visual order. They made sure you looked like what you were, and nothing more. And as you walk on, you can't help but wonder how many dreams were stitched into illegal sleeves, how many ambitions hidden behind a dull wool cloak, and how many punishments began with someone just wanting to feel beautiful. You're heading out of town again, down a quiet trail flanked by low stone walls and the occasional berry bush. The breeze here carries something earthy, rich soil, damp leaves, the faint musk of livestock. And not just any livestock. You're entering hunting grounds. Not yours, of course. You're a traveler, a guest, a peasant, for all intents and purposes in this tale. And that rustle you hear? That's not a squirrel. That's the sound of law waiting to pounce. Because in the medieval world, poaching was more than a hobby or a shortcut to dinner. It was a crime. And whether you were punished for it depended almost entirely on who you were, who owned the land, and how many people were willing to pretend you didn't definitely just stuff a rabbit down your tunic. Let's say you're hungry. Your family hasn't seen meat in 2 months. You set a small snare on the edge of a nearby forest. You catch a hare. You're careful. You skin it in the dark, bury the bones far from your hovel. But someone sees. And suddenly, you're being dragged to the manor by 2 retainers in brighter boots than you've ever owned. Your punishment? Could be a fine. Could be time in the stocks. Could be the removal of a hand. Some regions treated poaching on noble lands as equivalent to treason, not because of the rabbit, but because of the rights you violated. Now picture this. A nobleman decides he's had a rough morning and wants to stretch his legs with a hunt. He gallops through fields into woods, across peasant farmland, scattering sheep and crushing cabbages. When he accidentally spears a neighbor's goose, does anyone complain? Of course not. That would be insubordinate. That's the sharp edge of medieval hunting law. Animals belong to the rich, even wild animals. Deer, boars, hares. If they roamed land owned by a noble or the crown, they were essentially part of that noble's inventory, like moving statues with antlers. Historians still debate whether the severity of poaching laws reflected real concern over dwindling game or just aristocratic vanity. Likely both. After all, hunting wasn't just about food. It was about image, status. A rich man's deer wasn't dinner. It was a symbol. And the forests? They weren't public parks. They were tightly controlled ecosystems, often guarded, patrolled, and cataloged like living treasure chests. In England, forest law was its own separate legal system, one that could be as severe, or more so, than civil law. You pause beneath an oak tree. The bark is carved with initials, some old lovers, some just bored farmers. You imagine one of them, years ago, digging a shallow pit nearby to trap a fox for its fur. The risk wasn't just a scolding. It could mean lashes, or exile, or worse. Meanwhile, nobles had hunting privileges so sacred they were woven into treaties. One nobleman from Burgundy reportedly negotiated the right to hunt deer across 3 rival estates, despite the fact he never once ate venison. He just liked the chase, and don't even get started on royal forests. In many kingdoms, the king declared vast tracts of land royal forest, removing them from common use. If your sheep wandered in, fined. If you gathered firewood there, fined. If you so much as picked berries in royal woods, you risked punishment. In one infamous case, a woman was fined for collecting mushrooms. Mushrooms, the forager's equivalent of pocket change. You pass a gamekeeper's lodge now, abandoned, half collapsed, overrun with ivy. These were the enforcers of forest law. Many were poor themselves, but loyal to the Lord. Catching a poacher brought favor, sometimes even coin, and catching a noble doing something shady, well, you didn't. You looked the other way and tightened your laces. But the rich didn't just get away with poaching. They could make up hunting rights. Some lords claimed ownership of animals on lands they didn't even fully control. One baron argued in court that he had rights to airborne fowl that flew over his estate, even if they landed on someone else's. You'd think someone would question this, but no one wanted to argue with a man whose cloak weighed more than your monthly firewood. And while poor poachers were maimed, branded, or exiled, noble ones might get a gentle warning, or a cheeky note from a bishop reminding them not to overindulge. One record even shows a noble sentenced to speak an apology to a rival lord whose deer he hunted. That was it. No fine, no stocks, just words, presumably said through a yawn. Still, poaching persisted, because hunger doesn't read edicts. And when your children are crying and your fields are bare, a rabbit isn't just a symbol, it's survival. And so, traps were set, hairs vanished, and if you were lucky, no one saw. The forests, in that way, became both danger and refuge. A place where you could risk everything for a meal, and if caught, well, you'd better hope your cousin could read a psalm or your landlord needed a new chimney sweep. You stand now at the edge of a clearing. Sunlight pours through like melted butter. A stag steps briefly into view, majestic, golden-horned, utterly unaware of human laws. Then it's gone, and you're left wondering, how many people have starved with meat just out of reach? How many were punished not for greed, but for need? And how often did the law look away when the boots were made of silk? The sun dips lower now, casting long shadows across the trail as you leave the forest behind. The air feels heavier, quieter, like even the birds have decided to listen in. Because tonight we reach a darker chamber of medieval punishment, one where the pain was precise, deliberate, and disturbingly selective. You've arrived at the realm of torture. It's not quite what the movies tell you. There weren't always dungeons filled with screaming echoes and swinging chains. Sometimes, torture was quiet, clean, clinical, and it wasn't handed out like candy to everyone. No, torture in the Middle Ages was a tool used selectively, and often it was pointed down the social ladder, not up. Let's begin with the truth. Not all medieval societies embraced torture equally. Some, like the church courts, preferred confession by pressure rather than pain. Others, especially secular authorities, weren't so gentle. Imagine being a poor miller accused of theft. The evidence is thin, but the reeve suspects you, and the steward wants results. So you're questioned. You're brought into a small chamber, ropes, pulleys, a table that tilts. You're told, just confess, and it will end. Now imagine a baron is accused of the same crime, embezzling grain, defrauding tenants. His interrogation, conducted over wine, perhaps some sighing. At worst, he's told his estate will be reviewed. No pulleys, no rope burns, just some awkward family dinners. That's the thing. Torture wasn't just about the crime. It was about the body being considered acceptable to damage. The poor were seen as more resilient, shall we say, less delicate. If they limped afterward, well, they probably limped before. The rich? Their bodies were symbols of family honor, political alliance, divine favor. You couldn't just twist a nobleman's ankle until he screamed. That ankle was practically a relic. Historians still debate whether this class-based application of torture was conscious or subconscious. Did officials know they treated bodies differently? Or was it simply woven into the fabric of medieval thought? One thing is certain. The poorer you were, the more likely you were to meet the thumbscrews. Yes, those were real. Metal devices that slowly crushed your thumbs, knuckles, or toes. They weren't designed to kill, just to persuade. Then there was the rack, also real. It stretched the body inch by inch, pulling joints apart like a puppet on the wrong end of a string. Records show it was mostly reserved for accused heretics, spies, or traitors, unless you were rich. Then the very threat of the rack was often enough. No need to stretch someone with 4 surnames. You pause near a shed that leans slightly to the left. It might have once stored farming tools, or something less innocent. The kind of place where informal questioning happened. No judges, no clerks, just pain, stripped of ceremony. There are stories of the boot, a device into which one's leg was inserted and slowly crushed with wedges. In France, they used the strappato, a method of binding your arms behind your back and hoisting you into the air, then dropping you suddenly, over and over, until the joints gave out. And yet, for all these grim devices, the true punishment lay in the difference. Who got them and who didn't? A minor clerk in London was tortured for stealing parchment. A knight who skimmed royal taxes, pardoned, and later promoted. You step over a gnarled root, catching a glimpse of a stone ring embedded in the ground. Could have held a prisoner's ankle once, or maybe a cow. It's hard to say. That's part of the haunting charm of this place, its ambiguity. Torture was also uneven across geography. In Florence, legal torture was heavily regulated. Certain crimes, certain tools, certain time limits. In England, it was technically illegal except by royal order, but local lords still got creative. In Spain? Well, let's just say the Inquisition wasn't known for its restraint. And even when laws tried to curb it, there were exceptions. Torture was often permitted for servile people, that is, people without noble blood. That includes peasants, slaves, foreigners, and sometimes even skilled laborers who weren't affiliated with a guild. Your entire body was classified like a tool shed. Noble body equals protected relic, poor body equals experimental scrap. You come across an old hollow tree with strange iron hooks buried in the bark, rusted but suggestive. Someone thought this tree would be useful for something that wasn't picking apples. And the irony? Torture often produced bad evidence. People confessed just to make it stop. Some confessed to crimes they hadn't heard of. One man confessed to transforming into a wolf and devouring 3 chickens. He didn't even own a dog. Meanwhile, nobles got character witnesses, letters of support. He's always been a good man, except for that one time he kidnapped his cousin. And so the scales tipped over and over. In time, some nobles were tortured, but only when the stakes were high enough. Political coups, royal murders, scandals too big to hide. And even then, the methods were often toned down. Psychological pressure, strategic threats, a suspiciously strong whine. You sit on a flat rock now, listening to the silence. Torture wasn't about truth. It was about power. Who held it? Who feared it? And who learned to scream in the right language? And as you rise again, brushing dust from your cloak, you think. In the Middle Ages, the line between pain and privilege wasn't just real. It was sharpened daily. You leave the quiet woods and return to the dirt roads where towns gave way to fields and fields to murmurs. Because now we reach the place where punishment becomes spectacle of a grander, more terrifying scale. Not for the individual, but for the crowd, for the mob, for the uprising. Tonight, you walk in the footsteps of rebels and rioters, and what happened to them when they dared to stand up and didn't own land. Imagine you're a peasant in the late 14th century. You've spent your life bowing, bending, and being taxed into the ground. Then one day, a whisper spreads like wildfire. They can't tax what you don't give. And so you march, with pitchforks, torches, and a cry of solidarity. It feels powerful, revolutionary, until you see the gallows going up before the protest even ends. In 1381, the English peasants' revolt surged through London with fury and desperate hope. But when it was put down, the retribution was swift, brutal, and selective. Over 1,500 rebels were executed, mostly commoners, men with calloused hands and soot-stained faces, hung from trees, from gates, from their own barn beams. Their crime? Asking for a better deal? But the few nobles who'd quietly supported the movement? Most were pardoned. One even claimed he was misled by the mood of the room. That's how it often went. When a riot or rebellion broke out, the punishment came not just from the crown, but from the local lords, eager to set an example. Public executions. Long lists of names read aloud like prayers of deterrence. You pass one such gallows field now. Nothing remains but a few weathered posts and a tree whose branches grow just a little too symmetrical. Historians still debate whether these executions were truly meant to suppress rebellion or to satisfy revenge. Likely both, because nothing sends a message like a body swinging in the wind just above the heads of the hungry. And what of the nobles caught stirring unrest? Well, their actions were often reframed. Not rebellion, but political maneuvering. One baron who conspired with rival factions simply left court for a year. Another was sent on pilgrimage. You may notice a theme here. The poor get no metaphors. Sometimes punishment took subtler forms. After a rural riot in France, peasants were forced to rebuild the lord's manor, with no pay, a lesson in both loyalty and architecture. The group punishments were especially cruel. Whole villages fined, communities stripped of grain. In one case, every male over age 12 was forced to swear loyalty to the crown again, while barefoot, holding a candle on their knees. Ceremonial? Sure. Humiliating? Absolutely. You walk past a pile of broken stones. Once a wall, now just rubble. It might have belonged to a manor that was burned during a protest. The villagers who lit the fire? Gone within a week. Their homes taken, their families scattered. But the manor was rebuilt, with new guards. Even accusations of inciting rebellion could be fatal, if you were poor. One blacksmith was hanged after being overheard muttering that the bishop had enough boots to share. No uprising, just sarcasm, and a bad listener nearby. Compare that with the rich. When nobles rebelled, as they sometimes did, it became a chess match. Political negotiations, meetings behind closed doors, a scandal, yes, but one that ended with redistributed lands or newly arranged marriages. Not hanging, not drawing and quartering. The punishment methods for rebels were often designed for impact. Bodies displayed along roads, heads on spikes at city gates. In one German town, a man's tongue was nailed to a post for speaking against the tax rate. He died, of course, but the post stood for years, a mute sermon, and sometimes the punishments were ritualistic. In one revolt, captured leaders were dressed in women's clothes and paraded before execution, a symbolic stripping of manhood, courage, and class all at once. Even in death, the poor were made into morality plays. You stop at a worn wooden bench by a roadside shrine. There's a small carving of Saint Sebastian, arrows in his side, painful, beautiful, clean. Nothing like what happened to the villagers of Caddington in 1317, whose entire male population was flogged for refusing to pay a new tax. No saint's feast for them. And yet, for all the brutality, rebellion always returned. Because the poor knew the rules were written in ink that only the wealthy could erase. They rose up and were struck down, again and again. One noble was asked after watching a peasant uprising crushed whether he feared another. He replied, "They are like ants. Step once, they scatter. Step twice, they crawl again." That noble died in bed. The man he ordered executed for treason? Forgotten. Buried without a marker. You rise from the bench, your legs a little stiff, and continue walking. Somewhere ahead, a village bell rings. You wonder, was it once the same bell that rang to call a crowd to witness punishment, to hear judgment, or simply to remember that justice, like everything else, had its place? And if you weren't born into it, you'd better be quiet, or be next, or be... The road has circled back now, and you find yourself near the heart of town once more. The sun is just a smear of gold behind the trees, and the sky is slipping into that velvety blue that only seems to appear when the world is tired but not yet asleep. It's the perfect time, really, to talk about something both final and quietly absurd: royal pardons. Yes, after all the dungeons, duckings, whippings, and rope-tightening trials, there remained one last twist in the medieval punishment system: the king's ability to simply say, "Never mind." You see a group of children playing near the pillory, pretending, not understanding. One is the criminal, the others, the crowd. It's all in good fun, until you remember how often this little stage was real, and how often, even after the worst crimes, the right name could erase the script. Let's say you've been sentenced. You stole a sheep or a horse, or perhaps you incited a crowd to burn the taxman's barn. Your fate is sealed. Or is it? Because if you, or someone who liked you, could reach the king, all might be forgiven. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, legally. A royal pardon could cancel a hanging, wipe a record, even restore confiscated land. One scrap of parchment, sealed in wax, and suddenly the crime vanished like fog in morning sun. It was powerful, and, more often than not, it was for the rich. One young noble, found guilty of killing a priest during a tavern brawl, received a pardon on the grounds that he was still of promising age. Another, whose illegal toll road had caused famine in a village, sent a barrel of wine and a particularly elegant apology to the queen. He was not only pardoned, he was knighted 3 years later. But for the poor? Pardons were rare, unless your lord interceded for you, and let's be honest, most lords wouldn't recognize their tenants without a sheep between them. You were out of luck. There are records of entire villages petitioning for a pardon after an accidental fire destroyed noble property. The king's response? Silence. Historians still argue whether royal pardons were acts of mercy or simply tools of politics. The answer, predictably, is both. Mercy was shown, but rarely to the people bleeding in the mud. More often, it descended like a velvet curtain over scandal when the accused happened to sit at court. You pass a statue of an old king, stone crown, heavy brows, a scroll in one hand. At his feet, the inscription reads, "Justice tempered by mercy." A beautiful thought. But as you glance around at the crooked alleyways, the cracked stocks, and the worn gateposts of old punishment grounds, you wonder, whose mercy? One peasant man was pardoned, miraculously, after a minor theft. Why? Because he'd saved a lord's dog from drowning 5 years earlier. The dog remembered him. The Lord remembered the dog. So, indirectly, he lived. History's oddest chain of events. In contrast, a woman was hanged for stealing a loaf of rye bread. She had no dog, no lord, just 3 children and bad timing. You round the final corner and approach the square. A pageant is being set up. Children dressed as kings and queens, someone unfolding a painted backdrop of a castle. They will reenact a great royal act of forgiveness. No one will play the thief. That part has been written out. Some royal pardons were ceremonial, bestowed during feasts, coronations, or religious festivals. One king, on Easter, pardoned 40 convicts. 38 were noble. The remaining 2 were soldiers. All had been held for violent crimes. None had taken food. There was even a formal process called pleading the pardon. If you were wealthy enough, you could apply for mercy as if filling out a form. It required documentation, witnesses, and occasionally a bribe for the clerk. If successful, you received a sealed letter. If not, well, no refunds. And sometimes, just sometimes, the king would reverse a pardon, usually for the poor. One case describes a farmer pardoned for killing a deer, only to have the pardon revoked after a bishop protested. The farmer was executed within the week. You sit now on a worn bench, the square around you emptying out. The wind has calmed, and you think punishment in the Middle Ages was rarely about law. It was about placement, being seen, being unseen, being born into the right wool or the wrong shoes. The gallows are gone. The stocks are weathered. The pillories collect moss. But the stories remain, of thumbs crushed in silk ropes, of dirty hands whipped raw and velvet gloves quietly wiped clean. And you remember every tale you've walked through tonight. The scold in the dunking stool, the poet knight sipping wine in prison, the barefoot boy caught with a rabbit, the noblewoman pardoned for poison, the woodcutter denied for need. You wonder who deserved forgiveness and who never had to ask. And now the torches are out. The crowds have gone. The village is still. A thin line of smoke curls from a chimney, soft against the starlit sky. Somewhere, a dog lets out one last lazy bark, then curls into straw and forgets the world. You breathe. Let it out slowly. The road you've walked tonight, stone by stone, story by story, was long, but you've made it. No judgment, no gallows, no cold splash of water or scrape of rope, just breathe and stillness. Tonight was not a tale of monsters, no dragons, no ghosts, just people, flawed, frightened, proud, and poor, and others wrapped in silk who learned how to float above the fire. You lie down now, or maybe you're already lying down, letting the weight of old worlds fall away. Your thoughts drift, not to punishment, but to rest, not to guilt, but to grace. Because sleep is the greatest pardon of all. And in this moment, no one is watching. No one is judging. The courts are closed. The candles are low. And you, clever, quiet, kind you, have earned your escape. So close your eyes. Let your mind quiet. Let the cobblestones fade. And dream not of shackles or shame, but of soft grass, warm light, and shoes that always fit. Good night. End of script. Sweet dreams.